So we know when things are fair and unfair. I know that it's unfair when my sister gets twice as much dinner as I do. Or I know it's unfair if I have to do all the chores and nobody else has to do them. So it's pretty easy to tell when things are fair and unfair. So let's talk about fair and unfair and the American Revolution. The American Revolution is when America, which is the country where we live, decided that we wanted to be our own country. America used to be controlled by England. You can see in this picture that England is in Europe. That's way across the ocean from us, right here. So a long time ago, people left England and they traveled all the way over here to America, where we live now. And they created the 13 colonies. So you can see here, these are the 13 colonies, and here is Maryland. We were one of the original 13 colonies. So at this time, even though we were living all the way across the ocean from the King of England, the King of England was still in charge, and he got to make all of the laws. And the people in America didn't get any say. They didn't get to vote, and they didn't get to decide what laws they wanted to follow. So, as you can see, there are people here, and they're talking about how unfair it is that they don't get to vote. For a while, it was okay, and people didn't mind because they didn't think that the king was doing anything that was unfair. They thought that their taxes were fair, and they thought that all of the laws that he was making was fair. So they sort of just let it go for a while. But then in the 1700s, the king started doing things that the colonists didn't agree with. The colonists are the people that lived in the 13 colonies, the people that moved to America. So there are a couple of big things that the king did that the people really didn't think were fair. So the first is called the Quartering Act, and that meant that if there were British soldiers, then they could go into any house, and the people who owned that house would have to let that soldier live there and feed them and give them what they needed. So they didn't think it was very fair that soldiers could just walk in and they would have to feed them and let them stay in their house. They also didn't think that some of the taxes were unfair. So taxes, we talked about a little bit, but taxes are when you need to pay a little bit of extra money, and that money goes to the government to pay for things. So sometimes taxes can pay for things like school, or sometimes taxes can pay for things like the police. But the King of England was using these taxes in order to pay for a war that he wanted to start. And the colonists didn't think that was fair because they didn't get to vote and decide whether they thought that going to war was right or whether they felt like they should pay more taxes. So the colonists did a couple of things. They didn't want to pay the taxes, and in a lot of cases, they didn't even have the money to pay for the taxes on things like sugar and paper and things that they needed. So they started buying them from other places in secret. And then they didn't have to pay the taxes. But this made the king very angry because he wasn't getting the money he needed for his war. So he gave his soldiers the right to go into anybody's home and look for things that they bought not from that they didn't pay taxes on. And this made people even more angry because then soldiers could just come into their home and search it for no reason. Eventually, this made people so angry that the Sons of Liberty, which was a secret group that got together to talk about how unfair all of this was, eventually they did the Boston Tea Party. So the king, down here, had decided that the colonists could only buy tea from England. They weren't allowed to buy it from anywhere else. And this made the colonists so angry. So what they did is they went to Boston, which is where a bunch of ships were that were bringing tea in, and they threw all of the tea into the ocean. This ruined all of the tea, and that meant the king wouldn't make any money on it. So then the king did something that's called the Intolerable Acts. And the Intolerable Acts meant that the king wouldn't let anything come into America or to the colonies at all until the people of the colonies paid for the tea, and that was a lot of money, and they didn't have the money, and they didn't know who it was that had thrown all the tea into the ocean, so they couldn't make them pay for it. But the king wouldn't let anybody buy anything and wouldn't let anything into the country until they paid for it. So this made the colonists really, really angry because they needed to buy things, and they thought it was really unfair that just because a few people had thrown tea into the ocean, now no one could buy anything. They said, that's not super fair. So eventually, because of all these different things that the colonists felt were not fair, they declared independence. So independence meant that the king would no longer be in charge of them. The king wouldn't get to create laws and wouldn't get to tell them what to do anymore. So we celebrate that day, Independence Day, on July 4th every year, and the original Independence Day was July 4th in 1776. And after we declared independence, then the king said, well, you can't just do that, and we went to war with England, and eventually we won that war. So now we get to have our own laws, and we get to vote on those laws, and we get to vote for the people who are going to represent us. So we went through all of those things in our country that were really unfair, but now we've tried to make our system a little bit more fair and let everybody have a say in what they have to do. So everybody gets a vote, and that is something that we will talk about a little bit later.